Today we have Misha Tsodyks. Misha Tsodyks received his PhD degree in theoretical physics from the Landau Institute of Theoretical Physics in Moscow. He then held various research positions in Moscow, Rome, Jerusalem, and in the Salk Institute in San Diego, before joining to the Weizmann Institute in 1995, where he became a full professor in 2005. Misha Tsodyks worked on a wide range of topics in computational neuroscience, such as attractor neural networks, place-related activity in hippocampus, mathematical models of short and long-term synaptic plasticity, and today he's going to talk about understanding the capacity of information retrieval from long-term memory. Thank you for coming.
Okay, I'm was very glad to have the invitation to talk here. And just a second. I will present you a current stage of my research project that I'm involved with for several years now, about how the information is retrieved from long-term memory. So I want to start with acknowledging my collaborators. Sandro Romani was a postdoc at my group at Weizmann when I started working on this project. Then he was at Columbia University and now has a position at Janilia Farm. Etienne Kowiecki started his master project on this topic. Alon Rubin is a student with Nahum Molanovsky, Misha Katkov, postdoc, and Stefan Erkanatese, a new PhD student in the lab. And I want to especially thank two experimental groups, Bennett Murdock from Toronto and Mike Kahana, who provided me with the data, and I will show you later on their contribution to this project. Okay, let me I want to give you some motivation about why this topic I think is an interesting one. And so I want to build the talk around the idea of memory capacity. So neural networks, where I started working on memory models, the issue of capacity was the central one. So the question is, or was, how many memories you can store in a network so that you can then efficiently retrieve them. Now, if you think about the real memory and try to estimate what's really the capacity of a memory system, it's a difficult issue, among other things, because there are different types of memories. So when you talk about capacity, you may think about different things. On one hand side, our capacity is huge, right? We know a lot of things. All we are is basically due to things that we remember. So to illustrate this is my collaborator, Sandro Romani, came up with this pictorial introduction. So he says this is a list of the movies that he watched over the course of last, I don't remember now exactly, last month or last year, but this is a movies that he watched. So, and it's a lot of movies, so he clearly likes to watch movies very much. Now, he says that he remembers all of them, in the sense that if you show him a short clip of a movie, he will immediately recall everything, the actors and everything. So that's a lot of information. And these are just the movies that he watched recently. So, and there are a lot of examples like that, so the books that we read, etc. So if you think about memory capacity in this way, the memory capacity is huge. Okay? So he says that if you give him some cues, then he thinks that he didn't forget anything about the movie that he watched. Now, if you probe his memory capacity with another way, instead of providing them some cues, you just ask him to give a list of movies, just a list, without any detail, just a list of movies that he watched over the last year. This is a much, much more difficult task, and he will not recall all of them. Most of them he will forget. He will just report about just a small fraction of them. So if you think about capacity in this way, about how you can recall information, then it's very limited. And of course, each of you can come up with a lot of examples of real life, how you cannot recall things that you for sure remember, like here. So this type of capacity in neural network theory was not really addressed systematically. So I see one of the contributions to my project is just to clarify the differences between different types of capacity how we can address this recall capacity. I will call it retrieval capacity, recall capacity later on. How you can address it theoretically, and what does it depend on, etc. And so basically, we want to understand why it is so difficult to recall things that we remember very well. So in the this is a question that psychologists studied a lot, and mostly not recently, but a long time ago. The peak of this work was, I think, about 50, 60 years ago. So this was the paradigm that was developed then is called free recall. So free recall paradigm is a very simple one. I could just do an experiment right now if I had a little bit more time. I would just read aloud a list of words and would just ask you to recall as many as you can, without any limit of time, let's say, or order. So this paradigm was studied a lot by cognitive psychologists, and Murdock is one of the main experimental labs that provided some most important results, which I show you later on. So this is one of the results that he obtained then. So you can, so this is, he was doing pre-recall with subjects, presenting them lists of longer and longer list of words and measuring just how many words on the average the subjects could recall. Okay, so this is the direct definition of recall capacity, just to measure for a list of words of a given length, what's the fraction of the words the subjects can recall on average. And there are a lot of details here which are important, so I'll still just a little bit. So the words are selected randomly, so there is no obvious semantic relation between the words. They are read out quickly, so that the subjects don't have time to make some kind of a story or use some mnemonic tricks in order to recall more words. And then after some delay, the subjects are just asked to...
What are the axes?
Okay, so this is a list, the length of the list that he was presenting. So the largest here is 200 words, 400, I don't remember exactly. And on the Y is the number of words on the average that subjects were recalling. And this is the summary of his experiment of 1960, which I'll show you a bit more in more details later. So you will see that there is no fixed capacity. So this is one of the main misconceptions about this field. Is if you go around and ask people, what do you think, how many words you can remember in a long list of words, everybody keeps saying 7 words because they mix the short-term memory with this process. This is not a short-term memory task because you can make a delay and the list may be very long. So there is no fixed capacity. The number of words that subjects can remember or recall is increasing when the list becomes longer and longer, but the fraction of the words becoming less and less, and this is done on this plot is done on the log plot, so this indicates a power law relation between
there's no fixed capacity when you get to 200 stimuli, you know, if you were to use murder, right? There could be a fixed capacity.
It could be, right.
Yeah.
But at least on the range of words list that people studied, there is no fixed capacity. What happens later, it could be that if you have a very long list, then you start really forgetting the words. So as I will argue later, this behavior is, you can indicate, so you can get it even if you assume that you remember perfectly all the words in the list. Of course, if you start forgetting the words completely, then this will also affect the way you can recall.
What is the other curve?
So the other curve is another experiment where where instead of just asking to recall words, you give a word and you ask the subject to recognize whether the word was in the
other curve within this.
Okay, I don't remember this one.
You don't remember?
I don't remember.
Recognize. Small technical question. These are all words by English speaking from whom the words are familiar.
Yes, these are native English speakers, Canadian students.
Nonsense sounds.
No nonsense sounds, yeah, real words. This is just another paradigm where you show a word and ask if it wasn't released or not. And this is and so this just shows that the subjects don't forget the words. They remember the words. They can tell about the word whether it was in the list or not. And they have this subjective feeling that if you show a word that they remember that it was in the word, so it's not just a comparison, not just recognition, but it's really, they can recall the word with given a cue, but without a cue, for some reason, they cannot recall it. Okay, now why do we need a model for this phenomenon? This is a very developed field in psychology, in cognitive psychology, and they have very good models that basically describe this phenomenon very well. I'm not going to give a talk about this. This is a very influential model, which is called Search of Associative Memory, SAM, which was developed, among other things, to explain all sorts of results about free recall, not just capacity, but other more subtle things, which some of them I will present later. And this type of models, which assume a lot of processes and transitions between them, if you fit it to the data, you can have a very good fit to the results. So, and sometimes my reviewers who are from psychological field, they are very upset about my models because they say that we have models which are very old, which are much better than your model. So why is it that we need to publish your paper if we have such a beautiful model? So for example, this is the result. This is one of the examples of what this model can achieve. This is a serial position curve. This is one of the ways to present the results of free recall experiment, where you plot. So if you have a list of words, let's say 40 words, you plot what is the chance that the word on a given position in the list will be recalled. Okay. So you can see here several effects. You have an easier recall of the words at the end of the list, which is a short-term memory. So this has a fixed capacity of 4 words. You see that 4 last words have an increased probability to be recalled, simply because when you're done hearing the list, you still remember last several words are still in your short-term memory. Then there is this is called the recency effect. There is some advantage for the words at the beginning of the list. This is called the privacy recency. And then there is this plateau of the words which are in the middle, which is basically the main interest of my talk, is to explain this part of the recall, which is not a short-term memory recall. There are many indications that it is not a short-term memory recall. It takes much longer than this part. This is usually produced by subjects very quickly after they hear the list, but then they start recalling words in the middle of the list, and this takes much longer. This is so this is basically you can have a long delay between the presentation and the recall, so this plateau is not very sensitive to it. So this is what this is why I think this is not a short-term memory effect, but it's a recall from long-term memory. Okay, I was just showing this as an example of how good the models can fit the data. So you may ask also, why then do we need other models?
Yes, but this is not consistent with the previous result.
And why?
Because here the fraction depends a little bit about the length, but there was 0.2 in 1,000 out of 4,000.
This is a recall, not a recognition. So if these are 2 points. These are 2 points, 40 and 20. So like this and
So the slopes here are consistent with those slopes?
the slope is, yeah, it's the same data basically. You just plot it in a different way. Here you just, here you show only the total number of the words, and there you just divide it into serial positions. But the data is the same data. Good. I can, if you have something else, yeah. Okay, so I just want to, I have several reasons why these models, even though they're very influential, give you, I'm not saying they are in some sense irrelevant for the field, because they postulate all these processes that you can then study how they contribute to the recall. But in terms of my basic questions, which is how to give some generic explanation for why the recall is so difficult, I would argue this model cannot give a good answer, because they have many parameters that are not constrained by any measurements, and so by fitting them to the model, to the data, you don't really explain why the capacity is this and not much higher, right? If the experimental result would have a higher capacity, you would have the same model explaining this data perfectly well by tuning by another choice of the parameters. So if you want to have some more general understanding of the capacity, which is not necessarily quantitatively correct, but gives you some more generic answer about why recall is so difficult, I think this model is not the right way to address this question. Okay, another reason for why we need maybe more generic models is that this capacity is not just valid for the pre-recall paradigm. Pre-recall paradigm is one particular paradigm to study this issue, but it's a very specific one. And there is another paradigm that people developed, which is much less famous, but we found a paper which presented this result, is that you just try to recall things from long-term memory based on some very general feature of the information, but without actually acquisition stage. And so, for example, I can ask you to write down all the words that start from particular letter, right? Or I could think of something else. I could ask you to write down all the titles of all the books that you read over the course of your life, things like that. So I'm not telling you anything, I just ask you to recall things from your memory. And it's irrelevant, more or less, when did you learn these words, right? You don't know, you cannot say when you learned these words, but we can estimate reasonably how many words which start from different letters you remember. And then if I ask you to recall as many of them as you want, I can do the same kind of capacity estimate. So this is the table. So if you only look at the first column, this is the estimate of the number of words that start from different letters that the students would be reasonably assumed to know. Okay, and so we can use the fact that the number of words varies greatly between different letters. So the largest number of words you have of letters that start from letter S, so you have several thousands of them. But if you look at the words that start from letter W, you only have 7 of them. So you have a large range of vocabulary sizes that is naturally available for us, so we don't have to prepare any lists. And then you just measure how many words the subjects recall on the average. And again, if you plot them on the same log plot, you get a very similar relation. Okay, so this is a very different paradigm. There's no recency and primacy effect. There's no acquisition, but there is a similar result. And if you fit this to the power law, you get roughly a square root. So as a simple rule, I can tell you, and maybe that's the most important message that I want you to get out of this talk, is that the recall capacity is like a square root of the number of items in the list. Right? If I ask you to recall all of, let's say 100 items, you will recall 10 of them.
Was the square root also in the previous number?
Yeah, I will show you later more details on this. Okay, so so my first two questions are listed here. So why the recall capacity is so small? What's the problem in recalling more of the information? And is there some generic explanation for the power law scaling of this recall capacity? Okay, there are some questions about the questions, so ask me now, because now I will try to give you some answers that we came up with over the course of this project. So how is the neural network theories address the issue of long-term memory? So this is a very well-developed paradigm, which now mostly associated with the name of Hopfield, but was actually proposed by people before him, but was kind of crystallized by him in a very influential paper in 1982. And basically, according to this model, the long-term memories are realized as attractor states in the neural network. So there is a dedicated network that is storing information, and this network has some stable activity states, which are here, I plot them as dots here. So the recall, so this stable states of activity are encoding different memories that this network stores. And they are generated by modifying the connections in the network. So I'll give you some more details about it at the next slide. So when you learn something, you change the connection in the network such that you create this attractor state. So this is a learning phase. Then when you have to recall this information, you need to initialize the network in the vicinity of this attractor, in the basin of attraction. So this would be providing a cue. If you provide a cue for recall, you initialize the network, and then it converges to the attractor. This will be recall. Okay, so it's a very appealing idea that you have all these phases of memory in one model. Okay. So my contribution to this. So this was the first project that I worked when I switched to this field from physics. So my contribution was to make this model a little bit more realistic by introducing this idea of sparse coding. I give you a little bit more details about this because this will be relevant for the rest of my talk. So the model assumes that you have a network of n neurons. You have connections between them, all to all. So there are n square connections. So the memory patterns I assume to be this random sparse populations. So both of this is very important. So both randomness and the sparseness, which mathematically just means that this is a vector of 0 and 1s. And 1 means the neuron is participating in encoding of a given pattern mu, and 0 means that this neuron is not participating in encoding. And you generate these patterns by just simply choosing 0 and 1. So 0 is chosen with probability f. So on the average, the fraction of neurons in the network that are encoding an item is given by this parameter f. And we assume that this is a much less than 1, so there is a small fraction of neurons encoding a given memory. You have L patterns that you can store in this network. So the way you store the information in the network, as I said, is by modifying the connections. So this is a kind of a variant of the Hebb rule. So every time you want to learn a new memory number mu, you have to modify the connections. Basically, just have to make the connections.
CJ at the end.
Okay, this is J here, sorry. So you just make a modification such that if both neurons I and J are participating in encoding of memory, you make connection strong, and otherwise you make it weaker. So you can calculate the storage capacity. So this is a calculation that was type of calculation that was first developed here by Haim and Daniamit and Hanno Gutfriend. So if you calculate it for the model that I just introduced, you have this result that the number of memories that can be stored in the network is scaling with the size of the network, how many neurons you have, but it's also inversely scaling inversely with the sparseness parameter. So having a random sparse encoding is advantageous because it gives you an extra factor of 1 over n. Okay, so this is these are kind of results that I was, at that time, many people were very excited about the kind of results because they are nice and give some justification for some biological realistic parameter f. But if you think now about this, this is still these kind of results cannot really be tested in any way because there is no way you can really estimate the capacity of long-term memory in any reasonable way. Right? I cannot tell you how many things I have in my long-term memory. It will take a long time to test this, even if I try. And so another very important thing to point out here, which will be relevant for my talk, is that this assumption about the randomness is very important here, because any deviation from randomness will make this simple learning very inefficient, right? So the only reason why this simple Hebb rule is effective in storing the information is if these memory patterns are random. So they're not only sparse, but generated in a random way. And you can speculate whether this is indeed a reasonable assumption. I will just stick to this assumption for the rest of my talk, but maybe we can discuss it during the during the discussion session. So for now, I'm saying that the memories are represented as a random set of patterns, which make the learning, the long-term storage of information easy, right? Because you can just apply Kahana. Okay, so now how would you then address the issue of recall? If I tell you now, instead of recalling each item one by providing the queue for an item, let's say you have a network that stores some number of memories, and I ask you to recall all of them without providing a queue. So if there is no queue, then this idea, this recall mechanism that I showed you before will not work, because you will just converge to an attractor and then you will stay there. So one idea would be just to introduce a lot of noise to the system at all. Or another idea, and we can argue again why, I can speculate why I don't think this is how the brain works. The brain is not introducing noise in order to go from one memory to another. Because one simple argument is that this would mean that you actually forget the thing that you already recall, and this is not the case. But we can argue, I mean, this is more like speculative reasoning, so we can maybe discuss it later. But another idea would be that you may have a process of hopping from one memory to another, which is deterministic, not stochastic process. And one way to imagine how this would work is to introduce an extra inhibition in the network that would modulate between two different levels, such that if you are at the lowest level of inhibition, the network converges to an attractor. So this is just a schematic representation of three attractors, and each circle here represents an attractor. So let's say at the low level of inhibition, the network converges to an attractor. Then when you increase the inhibition, the attractor becomes unstable because the number of neurons that can be simultaneously active shrinks. So all of the neurons that are representing this attractor cannot be active simultaneously. So the network converges to another state which has fewer neurons that are active, and you can, by simple reasoning, you can realize that the neurons that will remain active are the neurons which are in the intersection between different representations. So the neurons that are participating in encoding of two memory items simultaneously. The reason for this is that the connections between these two neurons were reinforced twice, right? When you were storing this information, the connections between these neurons were reinforced both when you remember this one and when you remember another item, so they are the strongest connections in the network. So the stable state of the network at high level of inhibition will involve the activation of these neurons. Okay, so then this will become an attractor. It's like in the neural network theory what's called a spurious state, which is will not correspond to any memory item that was stored in the memory. And then when you reduce inhibition again, so if you have this modulated level of inhibition, then the network may converge to another attractor which corresponds to this circle. Okay, so this would be one potential mechanism of hopping between attractors, then this process can continue. So another idea would be, let's say, to introduce synaptic adaptation or neuronal adaptation. So there may be several mechanisms of how to induce the network to transit between different memory states. So this is a simulation of one of these networks, which has 16 memories stored in it, which is well below the storage capacity. So this is an important point, that we have very few memories in terms of storage capacity for this network. Yet when you simulate this process and when you see which memories are being recalled, so the red spots here represent the memories that are being recalled due to this mechanism, you will see that the network will hop between different memory states, but it will not always, there will be some memories that are never recalled, no matter how long you simulate this network, because it goes into the cycle, right? You can see that at some point it starts repeating. The same items will be repeated, will be recalled again and again. After some transient behavior, it will enter into the cyclic trajectory. So in this network, you will see then that out of 16 memories, about 8 are recalled. I think 8 are recalled in this simulation, and 8 will never be recalled. Okay, now these items are, as I said, this network is below capacity, so these items are still very stable attractors of the network. So if you start the recall from different items, you would have another set of memories that are recalled. So these are not this is not a forgetting, but this is a difficulty in recall process that happens due to the network is entering into this cycle. So we now basically want to understand why, what forces the network to keep recalling the same items again and again rather than recalling other items, and whether you can somehow get an estimate, mathematical analysis that would tell you how many items should be recalled in a network that stores a given number of items. So for example, why in this example, out of 16 items, 8 were recalled, whether this number 8 can be predicted, and what is the statistics of this number, etc. Okay, so now maybe I'm jumping a little bit. So the reason why this you can actually qualitatively you can have an idea why this process happens, because we assumed that the representations of items is random. So you have these groups of neurons are chosen randomly. So there is a chance that you will, when you follow this, you can think about these transitions as also effectively a random process, because they are driven by this randomly chosen group of neurons, and so you have these random transitions between items which can just at some point enter into a cycle. So the fundamental reason why not all the items are recalled is that representations are random. Okay, so we have kind of a qualitative answer is the randomness of long-term representations results in the repeated recall of the same items. So now we want to see, I want to tell you how to give how to estimate the number of items that can be recalled. So you need to come up with a certain prediction about what determines the sequence of items that are recalled and their numbers as a result. So here what I show is that the transitions between different items are determined here by the size of this representational overlaps. Mainly, more precisely, it means that if you have a certain attractor which is activated, the next attractor that will be activated is the one that has the largest, tend to have the largest intersection with the previous one. So here just illustrated by counting how many neurons represent each pair of items simultaneously, and then you have this matrix of 16 by 16 intersections, which I call now similarities, because in my view they represent the semantic or some kind of similarity between these items. And by following this trajectory, you can see that it always that tends to involve the hottest element here in this matrix. So for example, if you start from 1, then the largest intersection will be with the item number 16, so that's why you go to 16. If you start with 16, you go to item number 9, so this is the next item 9. If you go from 9, so it will be 12, so this will be 12, etc. So typically,
16 is in the
this will be 16, right? So the reason you didn't go to 16 is because you introduced some adaptation here. So this would mean that you will go immediately to the item that is previously recalled. So by having some adaptation, you prevent going back to 16. So you find the item, the next item, which is the second closest similarity. So after 16, there will be 12. So after making this observation, now you can reduce the model even further. So you'll have a kind of a next generation of the toy model where you say we have this matrix of similarities, which is computed as a scalar product of these vectors representing different items. So this is just counting how many neurons are representing a pair of items mu and nu. So you put this into the matrix, which is determined by this random vectors, representational vectors size, and then you just follow this simple rule that I described. You start from a certain item, which is the first one that you recall, and every time you look at the row of similarities, you find the largest one, and then you jump to this item.
Are these similarities constant?
Yeah, so here I assume that these similarities are depending on how these items are represented in long-term memory. So they are not modified over the course of this experiment. I will then tell you how to account for this primacy and recency effect that indicates that there is some kind of modification that happens during the call. But in the simplest variant of this model, you can just assume, so let's say if you think about this, not a free recall paradigm, but this recall from long-term memory directly, you can say that this similarity matrix is fixed because it was formed over the course of long-term learning, and this is just a given matrix. So this model, it's a statistical model because these vectors are random, so we cannot predict now what will exactly is the similarity matrix will be, but we can predict the statistics of this matrix because it's determined by our assumptions about the statistics of the memories. This statistical model has one free parameter f, which is the sparseness of representation, and again, the reasonable choice for this is some small number, much less than 1. And the question now is, can we say something about the statistics of the recall capacity here? Can we predict how many items can be recalled by following this this recall process, retrieval process, as a function of this sparseness parameter?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
You have some assumptions on the adaptation or the value of the inhibition that puts the system in the right regime, or does it stay over this?
Yeah, so after I describe the model in this form, I can now, I don't have to think about the network model and the particular mechanism, but I have to just to use this rule. So I say I always go to the largest intersection, but I prevent the network from immediately going back to the same item that was just recalled. So this is the consequence of having, in the network, of having neural adaptation that prevents the network to converge back to the same attractor many times. If you don't have this problem, if you don't introduce this, then as you can see, because of symmetry of this matrix, this process very quickly enters into a loop of just two items. Right? Because if you have two items that have a largest intersection, then we'll just go back and forth for one of them. So you can then either have to introduce noise in order to break this loop, or you have to forbid this just explicitly. So for now, because I want first to look at the deterministic model, I just say my model just makes an explicit rule that you cannot enter into this.
So the one of the value that you choose for inhibition,
Yeah.
doesn't it affect the fact that you choose only pairs and not triples?
Right. So of course, if I would increase inhibition even more, I would converge into a higher order intersection. So I assume that here you don't do this, even though you can think in some situations when this would also be a useful thing. But I assume that you only all the transitions here happen between over the intersections of two items and not three items. Okay, this is a graphic representation of this model. So you have a graph. Each circle here represents an item. The size of the circle represents the number of neurons that are encoding a given item. So you have a natural distribution of sizes because we assume a random encoding. So we put an arrow from each item to the largest intersection, and then so every circle has two outgoing arrows, one to the largest intersection item and another one to the next largest. And then you just follow these arrows, following these rules, and you ask how quickly you will converge to a loop. After you converge to a loop, you will just continue retrieving the same items again and again, because again this is a purely deterministic model, so there is no way you will then recall any of the remaining items. So I have to say something about the statistics of the length of these trajectories as a function of this three parameter, the sparseness of the representation. Okay, so this is I just show you the solution. There is a calculation that that I don't have time now to go into this because just it's many steps and it will take me a long time. So I just want to show you some other results. So this is the calculation that we did. So we have it's just another redrawing of the same process. You have items here, 1, 2, 3, represent the order of the recall. So let's say you recall one item, then you recall a second one, a third one, you went to K, and then you go back to item number 2. After you do this, you will just continue recalling the same items again and again. And I want to write down what is the average or the statistics of this Recall capacity here will correspond to K. So what is the statistics of this recall capacity K? If I have, in total I have L items in the list. We did a calculation. So we have a asymptotic behavior. We estimated the asymptotic behavior of the capacity when the list becomes long enough. Okay, so you have an average number of words that you can recall, and it happens that the result is that it scales as a power law of the list of the length. So this is published in this paper with Sandro Romani as the first author, so the calculation is presented there, so I just give you a result. And the power law depends on the sparsest parameter. So the nice thing about this result is that you see that the best possible behavior of this model corresponds to the limit of the very sparse coding, where you reproduce the square root scaling behavior, right? So this model, under no conditions, can recall more than a square root of items out of the list of the length L. And that's why I think this provides some generic explanation for this result, because you don't have really to fit any parameters in order to get this, right? There's no way, there would be no way to fit this model to other power laws. So if the result would be, let's say, 2/3, there would be no way the model would be able to explain this. Right? So there's a very strong hard limit about how good the recall capacity can be. And there is another prediction about the variance. So you can also, by similar calculations, you can estimate the variance of the number of words, and this is predicted to scale also as a power law of the number of items in the list, but with a power exponent which is twice as large. This is actually not a trivial prediction, because if you would compare this model to a more naive one, where you recall items independently with the equal probability, such that on the average you have a square root, or L to the alpha. If you have this independent recall of items, then because of the law of large numbers, the prediction would be that the variance will scale also as a power law with the same exponent, right? So the fact that we have here another exponent, not alpha but 2 alpha, is actually non-trivial prediction, and it indicates that the recall of these items is not independent from each other. This result, you can say, was already reported long time ago in this paper of 1960, but we were curious if this result somehow holds also with the data. So we asked Murdock if he had the data still to send us, and to our large surprise, he says that he has the data, even though the paper was already published 50 years ago. So he sent us this sheets of papers where you have this bars which indicate one trial of an experiment. So you have, let's say, this is the number of words in the list, and this is how many words were recalled, and this is how many subjects were participating. So every time there was one particular recall trial, you put a bar here. And already by just watching these graphs, you see that the average number is increasing, but also the distribution is growing. So if we plot this data by plotting the average and the variance as a function of the list length, so you have and you feed this graphs, feed this data with the power law fitting, so you get this exponent for the average and this exponent for the variance. So this is, you can say, compatible with the model, because it produces the power law which is less but close to 1/2, and this is also roughly compatible because it's about twice as large as this. But obviously the estimates for the variance are very noisy, so I would say this is more like a motivation to do more careful measurements, which should still be done in this model. Unfortunately, we don't have the data for this other experiment where subjects were recalling words which are based on the first letter, so I cannot tell you whether the variance result also holds for this other experiment. Okay, so I give you now the second answer. An answer to my second question is that the that the power law is generically emerges from the way distributions, the transitions between different items are generated. So if we assume the random distribution of neurons which are encoding a different item, then universally you get a power law. Plus this assumption about the recall process, so you get the power law scaling, which depends on the sparseness of representation as the only three parameters. So I have these two answers, so in theory I could just finish the talk here, but what I want now to present to you is some other directions that emerged when we got another data set, which is much, much bigger and more systematic data set about free recall that is collected by Mike Kahana. So Mike Kahana works at the University of Pennsylvania, and he has a human memory lab that is systematically collecting data in this recall experiments for many years now. So at the current stage, he has a data that is collected for 170 subjects. Each subject at this stage of the experiment did 112 trials, which are divided in 6 daily sessions. So there are 16. Yes. No. Not 16. I don't know what happened. Okay, I'll have to figure out something here. It's weird. So there are several daily sessions such that overall every
7 sessions per subject.
It's 7 sessions. Right. So there are 7 daily sessions such that overall every subject is doing 112 trials, and there are lists of fixed length 16. So this experiment, we cannot here address the issue of capacity because there are no lists of various lengths, but as you will see, there are many other interesting observations that you can try to see if the model can account for them. So we were just too tempted to work on this, and then after you start working with this data set, then you have a lot of interesting observations, and then this is basically probably will never end, so we'll just continue working on this. So what are kind of things that we now can test? So we want, of course, the model has a very direct prediction that you would be able to test if you knew how the words are represented in the brain, right? If you knew this encoding, then you would just directly go and see if the transitions, let's say, are occurring between words with the largest intersection. Because this is a purely behavioral data, you don't have this. The interesting result from the model is that you can introduce that the chance for a word to be recalled depends on the size of its neural representation. So if you simulate this experiment that I just described for you, so exactly the same number of items and exactly the same number of trials, then you can ask. So the experiment is done in such a way that you have a pool of words, and then every time you select randomly a set of 16 words. So overall, there is about 1,500 of words that are used in this experiment, but every word is presented many times. So now you can ask if each word has exactly the same chance to be recalled when it is presented, right? In other words, are they easy or difficult words for recall, or every word is equally easy or difficult? So if you simulate the model, then there is a very strong result here that the probability, which we call P-rec, that the chance that a given word is recalled, if you just count all the instances where the word was presented, is very tightly controlled by the size of its neural representation, right? So this is a relative size, just a percentage of neurons that are representing a word. So average sparseness parameter here was 5%. And you see, if you plot this recall probability for a word as a function of the size, there is a very tight relationship. So we can, in the model, if you measure the recall probability of a word, it's a very good proxy for the word, for the size of the word representation. This is another plot which shows that the words that have a higher recall probability, they tend to be recalled earlier than the words that are recalled, that has a small recall probability. So this is why nobody of you asked me, but if I go back to this graph, I show that there are large circles and then which are followed by the smaller circles, because the words that have a larger representation then tend to be recalled early on, and then they basically overshadow the recall of the smaller words. So the reason actually why the recall capacity here is less than the square root is precisely because you have these interactions between the words of different types. This is what this calculation indicates, which I don't have time to show you. Okay, so now we can, so the first question for the data set is this prediction about words, the distribution of words into easy and difficult ones, whether this holds, right? Whether different words have systematically different recall probabilities. So I will keep this prediction for later, but here there is another more subtle observation, which I want to illustrate here by comparing to these two graphs. So this is the graph which I just described to you. This is the probability to recall a word as a function of the word size. Okay, so the larger words, larger representations have an advantage in terms of the recall probability. This is another graph where I simulate this model by, this is a simulation with a fixed sparseness parameter f, which is 5%. So now I simulate the same model, but I change the sparseness parameter, right? So I change it in the range from 1% to 20%. And as these analytical calculations indicate, the recall capacity of this model decreases. So if I have the average sparseness parameter 20%, the recall is more difficult than the recall when I have 1%. So here you recall half out, approximately 8 words out of 16, and here you will recall 0.4 out of 16, so it will be, I guess, roughly 6, 7 words. So there is a significant change in the recall capacity. So if you look at these two graphs together, they look like a contradiction, because in this case, in this graph, the large words have advantage relative to the small words, right? Because they have a higher recall capacity probability than the small words. But if you make all the words larger, you actually end up recalling fewer words. Okay, so why is this? Why this apparent paradox? How can we resolve this apparent paradox? Because these are all simulations of the same model. So the reason why, so the explanation is like this: the reason why the recall capacity decreases when you increase the sparseness parameter is precisely because the variability in the sizes of these representations become bigger, right? So the reason is not that the average size is becoming bigger, but because the variability, the variance in the sizes of representations is also increasing when you increase, because of the statistics of the way the patterns are chosen, the variance of the sizes is increasing with the sparseness parameter. So to prove that this is the reason why the capacity is decreasing, I can just do another simulation where I pick the words of a fixed size, right? Instead of randomly assembling the words in the list, I go back to this simulation, so I have a capacity of sparseness of 5%, but now I prepare my list such that a list has a fixed size of the representation. And now if I plot the recall capacity, or how many words are recalled as a function of the size, so here the words are all of the fixed size, there is no dependency. So I go back to this best performance that I can have here at the limit of zero sparseness. So this proves that no matter what the size of my representation is, if my words have all the fixed size, the number of words will not depend on this size, right? So in other words, you can say that if you selectively prepare the list of very difficult words, or very easy words, or intermediate words, it will not matter for how many of them you will be recalled. So this is one of the possible predictions of this model, is to prepare the list of words in a very specific way.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is the variance of the standard deviation over the mean size which is important?
So it's actually the covariance. If you do the calculation, it's a covariance in the sizes, which is growing with f. So the statistic which growing with the F is the one that goes into the
collision coefficient.
Correct. It's a covariance in the size, so which is growing with F.
Not relative to the...
Not relative to the size. Okay, this is basically the proof, right? Because if you kill the variance, then there is no dependency. So the statistic that is growing with F is responsible for this decline in the capacity. If you kill the variance, then there is no dependency, and you actually go back to the optimal performance. So this point is the limiting position of this curve when you go to zero sparseness parameter. So this just proves that the only factor that is responsible for this declining capacity is the variance in the sizes, not the average size. Because here the average size is increasing. Okay, so we cannot test this prediction directly because in the experiment that was performed, that the words were assembled completely randomly, right? So every list has a random selection of words of different recall capacity. However, there is a trace. You can design a statistical test that would kind of confirm or falsify this observation, because instead of we don't have the list of a fixed recall probability, but naturally we'll have a list where the average recall probability of the words will vary, right? So if you just randomly choose 16 words out of a large pool, which with a recall probability that is distributed between 20% and 80%, then also if you look at the average recall probability of the words in the list, this will have some variability, right? It will be less than variability for a single word, but it will still have a finite variability. So you can now look at the variability of this average recall probabilities of this list and ask whether this is correlated with the performance, with the recall, with the number of words that you recall. So let me show you exactly how you do it. So you have let's say this is a particular trial of this experiment. Before you analyze the data in this way, you just go over each list in the pool, and you compute each word in the pool, and you compute the average recall probability for the word, right? So for every word now I can assign a number, T, which is just overall what's the chance that this word will be recalled if it's presented in the list. Okay, so now I can write down these recall probabilities at each position. So this will be one presented list, and let's say you recall out of these 16 words, you recall 5 words, so you can write down the probabilities for this word. So this will also tell you which word you recall and in which order. So in this experiment you recall the last 2 words, then you jump to word number 3, then you jump to word number 1, and then to 9. Okay, and every trial you can present in this way. So now you can ask what's the average recall probability of the words that are presented in the list. So this tells you on the average how easy this trial is. Right? So you can think if all the words are easy, then the whole trial should be easy, naively. So you can then ask whether this average recall probability of the word that is presented is correlated with how many words you recall during this trial. Right? This is one question you can ask. Or you can also correlate this number with the average recall probability of the words that are actually recalled. So this is another statistical test that you can do. So you can correlate the number of words that you recall with the average recall probability of presented words or average recall probability of the recalled words. So this is the model prediction. So if you just compute these correlations in the model, so we have this sparseness parameter, which is the free parameter in the model. So this is the first correlation coefficient, and you see robustly, no matter which sparseness parameter you choose, you predict that this correlation is around 0. So it means that the average recall probability of the words in the list is not correlated, is not statistically correlated with the number of words which are recalled. Right? So you can have a list which is accidentally have very easy words, or you can have a list which accidentally have very difficult words, but this on the average will not change the number of words that are recalled. So this is the meaning of this 0 correlation. And there is another correlation which is robustly negative. So if you look at the average recall probability of recalled words, we have a negative correlation. So it means that in the trials where you recall only few words, these words tends to be easy. Right? So you have a higher recall probability. And in the trials which are more successful trials, what you call more words, these words tend to, on the average, to be more difficult. And this is arising because of this shielding of difficult words by the easy words, right? If you happen to recall several very easy words at the beginning, the chances will be that they will shield the more difficult words, and you will end up recalling fewer words. So again, if you compare it with a naive model where you just recall words independently with the corresponding probability, then of course you'll have a positive correlation of this type, because each word is recalled with the independently. So if you have easy words, you will end up recalling more of them, and this correlation ends up to be zero. Okay, so you have this complementary pattern of statistics that we can now go and test. So here everything can be directly measured in the data, because you can estimate the recall probability of a word, so you can just compute this correlation coefficients. Okay, so these are basically two predictions. You have easy versus difficult words, and you have this non-trivial interaction of shielding of easy, difficult words by easy words. So we went to the data. So if you just count how many times every word is recalled when it is presented, you have this distribution of the recall probabilities. So now this could be just, it's hard to say a priori whether this is a real thing, or just because the number of presentations is still not so great, because we have a large pool of words, so you don't have many presentations for a word. So in order to assess whether this distribution is really reflecting the ingenious difficulty or easiness for a particular word to be recalled, you divide the subjects into groups, and then you compute the recall probability for one group and another group. So this is the graph. So you have this is just an example. You can divide them in many ways, of course, but this is one random division of subjects in two distinct groups. And you see that overall there is a high correlation between recall probabilities. So the words that are easier to recall for one group of subjects tend to be easier to recall for other groups of subjects, and vice versa. So I cannot say really what is the main factor behind the spread. So this is not a straight line. So this could be because there is a limited amount of data. So if I would, there are several factors that go into this spread. So one is that words are not presented infinitely many times. The second is that we have this effects of primacy and recency, and different words are not equalized in terms of whether they are shown at the beginning of the list or the end of the list. So this creates another scatter. That's, I think, the two factors that I can think of. So we need more experimental data in order to see whether, in fact, this spread can be reduced even further. But at least even with this amount of spread, it's clear that the words have systematic differences in terms of their recall probabilities. So we can now also use this fact to create the statistics of this correlation coefficient, because we can have many different ways of dividing subjects into two groups. So you can use it to validate the results. You can use one group in order to calculate the recall probability of the words, and you can use the results of another group in order to compute the correlations between recall probability and the number of words recalled. So you prevent the overfitting of the data to this calculation. This is just shows that indeed the easy words are recalled before difficult words. So this is okay. So we have this distribution now, because we can have this validation technique by dividing subjects into different distinct groups. We have for every correlation you can also have a distribution, so you can also assess the significance. So this is let me first look at the model. So this is naive model. What the naive model predicts. So as I showed you, there is a positive correlation between the recall probability of the words in the list and the number of the words that are recalled. There is a zero correlation between the number of words that are recalled and the average recall probability of the recalled words. So this is the prediction of this model. Our model predicts the opposite results. We have zero correlations of this type and negative correlation of the blue type. And this is the data that we get, and you see that overall it's very close to the model. There is a little bit of increase in the correlation coefficient here. So this is just on the edge of the significantly positive correlation, but overall, of course, this is much closer to this model than to the naive model. So you can say that overall this prediction is confirmed. Now the caveat here is that we have a model which doesn't have all these effects of recency and primacy, and another effect is contiguity, which I'll show you a bit later, and the data is coming from the free recall experiment. So as I told you, we don't have the data from another paradigm where we would not have this problem. So we were just curious whether this effect will also remain if you introduce this other details in the model. So I just show you very briefly what we did. We introduced the contiguity effect by am I done? Okay. Okay, I will just skip it. I just skip it, I think. We have a more realistic model. Let me just tell you. We have a more realistic model that has contiguity, primacy, recency. It has a stochastic recall. So we are having these transitions with the probabilities that depend on the similarities. So this model can be now, is very similar to the data in terms of this serial position curve. It generates a very similar time course of the recall, how the recall becomes slower and slower if you increase the time. This is a distribution of inter-recall times, which is a very interesting result, but I have no time to show this. I just show you that this extended model has the same pattern of correlations that our original model, so these effects don't really interfere with this result. So let me just stop. I have a lot of other results that let me just summarize. I just list the answers to the question that I posed at the beginning. We have we assume that long-term representations are random, which was necessary assumption in order to have the recall easy, to store it easy, so that the have rules would be effective rules. But the same reason that the same randomness would also limit the recall capacity, because it would create these random transitions. We have some generic explanation for power law scalings. This is that I didn't have time to show you, but this is a very interesting observations on the data that show that actually, if you practice the recall, you can improve. You will recall more words. If you but this is very variable among subjects, and the recall is very this improvement is non-trivial. It's not that you're just recalling more words, but you will recall them in a more systematic way, but I have no time to talk about it.
Okay, thank you very much. I have time for questions.
So, during your talk, you tended to speak of memory as items. Could you define what exactly one item of memory would be?
In this model, the item is one representation of a fractal. So when I recall a word, I assume that the network converges to the fractal. So every group of neurons that is encoding a certain memory, for me, is an item.
Yeah. So in the initial version of the model, it was completely deterministic, and I understand that you have a stochastic version, but I wonder to what extent empirically are subjects strongly biased by the last word that they recall? Is it known?
So I would say that the way I think about it now, the true recall process is weakly stochastic. It's not very strongly stochastic, because otherwise, if it would be strongly stochastic, you would just recall everything that you have always.
But then it would be
So the question is, can you really prove that this is only weakly stochastic and not? So for this, you will really need to assess that how predictive the transitions are. These experiments never do this, because they never present the same list twice.
It sounds like something that you can do. I mean,
right. So this would require a special experiment.
Maybe my question relates to what you did not discuss, and this is that the notion that once we recall a memory, an attractor, we go back in a slightly different way. So maybe you hinted for this or not? Because today we think that there is no real consolidation. You just remember, yes?
I'm not sure exactly. Yeah, you probably
I
mean
mean,
that the
once you
representations are
recall
not
a
really
memory,
fixed, right?
you put it back in memory
Right,
in a
and
slightly
let's say
different way.
right.
Yeah.
So obviously, I assume that at least when you do the experiment, there is no significant change in your long-term representation.
No, but if you have several sessions,
If you have several sessions, then this all can be changed. Yeah, I don't know how to.
So the model
In
right
the
now is
model
one
just
session.
assume the fixed representation.
I thought by learning you mean you test.
No, learning is kind of implicitly assumed. So you assume that you are done with the learning, so you have this representation, then you just recall. If you keep learning anew, then of course this will change.
Okay, thank you very much.